Folks, thanks for joining our Zoom discussion tonight. And these discussions, as you know, we're having at a time of pandemic, and Dave Sharma makes a welcome first appearance at the Sydney Institute. Obviously, he's very well known to all of us on the call, but the topic for tonight is From Foreign Affairs to the House of Representatives, a reflection. And Dave Sharma has a background, a law degree from the University of Cambridge, joined the career, became a career diplomat, represented Australia in Papua New Guinea, in Washington, DC, and of course has played a very important role as Australia's ambassador to Israel. After that, he went into business and technology and consulting, and from May 2019, the member for Wentworth. So Dave Sharma, you're very welcome. And from Foreign Affairs to the House of Representatives, let's hear your reflections.
Thanks so much, Gerard and Anne and everyone here at the Sydney Institute, and thank you for having me as your guest, and thanks to all the guests who are joining online. There are times, and I've found this since I've joined into politics, when I despair somewhat about the state of public debate in modern society, a growing innovative manner, the frequent attribution of bad faith, corruption and other ill motives to one's political or ideological opponents, the triumph of emotion and intensity over the merits of a particular idea or viewpoint, and at times the unseemly scramble to seize the moral high ground and assume the unimpeachable status of a martyr in order to obliterate and discredit competing ideas and viewpoints. I think we've seen a general coarsening of public debate, driven in part by the high degree of personal denigration that characterises social media platforms and commentaries. And I don't believe we're well served as a country, as a public, as a people by these trends. It was Abraham Lincoln in his first inaugural address that coined the phrase, the better angels of our nature. And it was an appeal that he made at the time of growing separatist sentiment, which would soon break out with the bombardment of Fort Sumter, to cool secessionist passions. It was a counsel in favour of unity and friendship, and one against precipitate action and against needless partisanship. And Lincoln said that though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. Well, Lincoln's warning, of course, failed. The United States shortly thereafter erupted into civil war. But I think his appeal to the better angels of our nature, that phrase from his first inaugural address, is one that's worth remembering and reflecting upon today, because I think too often the nature of our contemporary political debate is one that tends to bring out the worst angels of our nature. And that's why, by way of a long introduction, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to speak to the Sydney Institute, to address you all, to talk about a topic at some length, to develop an argument, to delve more deeply into issues without the fear of being shut down or cancelled, that these opportunities are so precious. So I wanted to once again thanks Gerard and Anne for having me here tonight, and the audience too. And it sure beats spending a lost hour debating on Twitter or somewhere else like that. Now tonight I'm speaking about my journey from Foreign Affairs to the House of Representatives, or from diplomat to politician, and some of the things I've learned along the way. So I'll start a little by telling my personal story. Like many who call Australia home, my story starts on the other side of the world. My father was born to an Indian family in Trinidad and Tobago in the West Indies, the youngest of 9 children. And his family was part of the wave of migration from British India to Trinidad to work on the sugarcane plantations after the slave trade had ended. My paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, was a pundit, or a Hindu priest, and despite this social status this gave them amongst the Indian diaspora in Trinidad, his family was of very modest background and means. They saved hard for an education for him and invested in him as the youngest of 9 children to send him off to London to go to university there. And it was he arrived just after the war had ended in London in 1948, becoming the first in his family to receive a formal education, and eventually going on to practice law at Lincoln's Inn. And it was there at Lincoln's Inn that he met my mother, an Australian girl from Sydney. And like many of her generation, her era, she'd sailed from Sydney to London in the early 1960s, just after she turned 21, looking for an adventure. And she soon found one when she met my father. They fell in love quite quickly, got married, had children with my elder sisters being born in Trinidad and Tobago, myself in Canada, and before we eventually moved back to Australia in the late 1970s when I was about 3 years old to be closer to my mother's family. Now, I lost my mother at quite a young age, and she lost her life at quite a young age. In fact, the age I am today to breast cancer, and I was 12 years old at the time, and my sisters having by that stage left home when my mother passed, it fell largely to me, largely to my father rather, to raise me and to a degree my mother's extended family. It's not uncommon with these sorts of tragedies, but I was prompted to grow up quite quickly and become self-reliant from quite a young age as a result. Encouraged by my dad to follow in his footsteps, I applied and was offered a place at the University of Cambridge at the end of my final year of school in Sydney, where I started off studying science, but then changed to law. And at the end of my degree, I faced my own sliding doors moment. I was tempted to join a lot of my university colleagues and go to London and work in banking or finance or law, as many of my friends were doing at the time. But it was something that I think pulled me back to Australia. And it was a vague sense of patriotism that I was Australian first and foremost. And so I had a duty to contribute here, but also a vague sense of optimism that Australia was still a nation in formation with its best years ahead of it that drew me back here. So upon returning to Australia, I joined what's known as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, or DFAT, as a graduate in 1999. And at that time, I didn't have a clear sense of what a career in the public service or indeed in diplomacy looked like. But I had an interest in the world beyond Australia's shores and Australia's place in that world, and a desire to contribute in some way in that project, and DFAT seemed a logical and obvious place to start. My first overseas assignment was with the Australian Defence Force in Bougainville, Papua New Guinea, where we had a peacekeeping mission before I moved to our High Commission in Port Moresby. And over 3 years, I worked to help resolve the Bougainville conflict and forge a durable peace to that conflict, the most bloody conflict the Pacific had seen since the end of the Second World War. And that peace, the Bougainville Peace Agreement, and that political settlement still hold to this day, which is a remarkable and often unsung achievement of Australian diplomacy. My time in Papua New Guinea gave me a very deep affection for that country and its people, an understanding of the vastness of the development challenges it faces and other nations in the Pacific, and a sense of Australia's unique and special responsibility we have to this part of the world. After my time in Papua New Guinea, I went on to work for Alexander Downer during the Howard government, which was one of the, that partnership between Downer and Howard being one of the longest lasting and most productive partnerships of Australian foreign policy, in my view. And working for Alexander gave me an insight into foreign policy decision-making at the coalface, but also an appreciation for the sort of workload that ministers face. So Alexander was simultaneously the foreign minister, a senior cabinet minister with responsibilities across the government, a senior party figure with party responsibilities in the South Australian division, a local member of an electorate, and at times it was quite a difficult electorate. Of course, we don't hold that electorate currently, it's held by an independent. And on top of this, he was a husband and a father as well. And it gave me a sense of the sorts of demands that are placed on our ministers and some of the expectations that they're expected to manage in order to perform their job well. After this time, I spent around 3 years in our embassy in Washington, DC for the final few years of the Bush administration, the first 6 months or so of the Obama administration, helping to work on and encourage what became known as the initial US pivot to Asia or rebalance to Asia. And certainly in my career, a sound understanding of how the US political system operates and how it works is indispensable to understanding global politics and strategy of today. Washington is the Rome of our day. And so I was very fortunate to have that experience. After returning from Washington, I helped lead the international division in the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. And that was during Julia Gillard's time as Prime Minister. And in fact, I worked quite closely with her and I still regard her very fondly in that respect. And it was from here back in Australia and by a Labor government that I was appointed Australia's ambassador to Israel. And my 4 years in that role left me with a high degree of admiration and respect for the state of Israel, the Jewish people, and all they've achieved under tremendously trying circumstances. It also gave me a deep affection for the Australian Jewish community, and I think has led to the belief that I myself am Jewish. Well, in fact, I'm not. Many people assume I am, but I'm always happy to be described as a friend of the Jewish people and a mensch from time to time as it's warranted. Now, I think it's undoubtedly true that for members of Parliament, the perspectives we bring to Parliament and our life experiences beforehand shape the attitudes we take and the issues that we tend to adopt when we're in Parliament. And I see this all the time with my own colleagues, each of whom brings a unique set of life experiences and professional experiences to bear on any given issue. And when this works well, it's a real strength of the place. But I think I'm happy to acknowledge that Parliament still falls short in this regard, that as an institution, it doesn't adequately reflect or embody Australia as a nation. And when we talk about diversity, and this is what a lot of people have been talking about, I think, in the last few weeks, this should really be our focus. The Parliament, I think, does a decent job of reflecting Australia's diversity when it comes to ideology and when it comes to geography, but it falls short when it comes to areas like country of origin and ethnicity, like religion and belief, like professional and educational background, disability, sexual orientation, and of course, gender as well. And I think part of the problem there is that, to my mind anyway, there are still too many careerists in Parliament, people for whom politics has been their only vocation. And the internal structures and workings of both the major political parties do not currently lend themselves to a wider recruitment of people, a wider recruitment pipeline, with insiders still being privileged by and large over outsiders. And my own experience as someone without a long party pedigree or history, making the leap into elected office, I think, is very much the exception rather than the norm here. Now, my party, I think, is currently engaged in a much needed debate about how to broaden the number of women within its ranks, but also to broaden the diversity within our ranks. And I think we need to make sure that we focus on a number of these metrics when we're doing this, and that we are harnessing all of Australia's strengths by recruiting political talent from across the nation. This will lead not only to better policy, but also to better politics. And I think my sense is very much that people need to see something of themselves in their elected representatives, and the party that can do a better job of reflecting the public, not only in its values and its policies, but in its composition, will be in a stronger position electorally. And I think the United Kingdom Conservative Party is a study in this. In the space of barely a decade, they've gone from a party that was predominantly old, white and male, to characterise it, and drawn from quite a narrow set of breeding grounds, to one that's positively cosmopolitan, recruiting many more women, many more people from ethnic communities, and many more people from diverse professional backgrounds. And as a result, and as we've seen in recent elections, the UK Conservative Party's electoral appeal now stretches well beyond their traditional constituencies. And I'm encouraged in Australia here just by my own coalition class of 2019. This is the members of Parliament who entered Parliament in the last election from the Liberal and National parties. We've had this coalition class of 2019, the same number of women as men elected. We've also drawn from diverse professional backgrounds, from veterans to childhood psychologists, social workers to vice chancellors. And we've got the first Australians of Chinese background and the first Australians of Indian heritage elected to the House of Representatives. And I think as a party, we need to make sure that this broad composition is replicated in future intakes, as ultimately this is how we'll change the composition of the party around of the Parliament. Now, whether we do this by decree, by quota, or by some other means, I don't think is especially material, but I think it's incumbent upon each of us as sitting MPs to be fostering and supporting the next generation of political leaders within our party, and making sure that future intakes of coalition members of Parliament are as or more diverse than the 2019 intake. For me, my own perspectives and priorities in the Parliament reflect my career and background, and my time spent representing Australia overseas, and indeed even the fact that I tend to approach Australia somewhat with the eyes and viewpoint of an outsider, my father having been a migrant here, has given me two important lessons. Firstly, that Australia is a remarkably successful nation, and we too often can lose sight of that or fail to reflect that in our public debate. We're secure and we're prosperous. We're united and we're harmonious. We have some of the highest living standards in the world. We have some of the most generous and supportive social services in the world. We've got some of the highest degrees of personal freedom and some of the highest degrees of social and income mobility. And by and large, a comfortable middle-class existence is open to nearly all Australians. And we're prepared to share all this quite generously, taking in hundreds of thousands of new arrivals each year and allowing them and granting them the right to call Australia home. Second thing that I think I always approach political debates with is a sense that nations are precious and fragile things. And again, my time abroad, and particularly in conflict-prone regions like the Middle East, but even in emerging, very undeveloped countries like Papua New Guinea has taught me that. And there is really nothing preordained, to my mind, about the path that nations take. Through poor decisions or a failure of leadership, they can quite readily run off the rails. They can indulge in mindless factionism, or they can be captured by a leadership class whose interests do not align with those of their nation. And when I wanted to characterise the political debate in Australia, I think too often progressives in their desire to outfashion one another take our national success for granted and trash our national institutions and our achievements as a way of demonstrating their own modern outlook. And that way lies complacency. It's hard to preserve what you don't value. But at times, conservatives who rush to defend Australia and its institutions from what they see as unwarranted assault fail to recognise our shortcomings and the need to modernise institutions and norms to reflect evolving national attitudes and evolving national composition. And that way lies stasis and stagnation. I'm firmly of the view that if a nation is not going forward, it's likely to be or at risk of going backwards. And today I wanted to talk about three specific policy areas where I believe Australia should be pushing forward more and orienting ourselves more towards the future. Now, as the bushfires raged last summer, the Australian Bureau of Meteorology was hard at work on a daily and on an hourly basis. The Bureau depends heavily on Earth observations from foreign satellites to track and predict weather. And in doing so, they assimilate the data from around 30 or more Earth observation satellites. And satellite data is integral to the Bureau of Meteorology's operations. They reduces their forecasting error by around 70%. And without satellite data, they'd be hard pushed to provide accurate forecasts beyond one day. Now, as the bushfires were raging, the bomb, as it's known, was sucking up satellite data at a high rate to pinpoint the location of fires and to identify smoke plumes in real time, to provide actionable intelligence to our emergency services, to assist in firefighting efforts and to assist in evacuation efforts. But here's the catch, and this is something quite surprising I learned just recently. Australia does not own or operate a single Earth observation satellite. All of that satellite data we rely upon and obtain comes from data streams from foreign satellites. And to generate during the bushfires the real-time intelligence and observation of the bushfires that we need, we had to get help from Japan and Korea and their own Earth observation satellites. Both countries provided us with additional rapid update data from the geostationary satellites, which increased the frequency of the scanning and gave us a higher resolution of imagery. And without this boost to our capability provided by Korea and Japan, our firefighting efforts would have been considerably harder. Now, think about this. We in Australia are the sixth largest country by land mass. We have one of the largest exclusive economic zones in the world at 10 million square kilometres. It's a marine area that exceeds our land mass by about 30%. Under international aviation agreements, we have responsibility for providing forecasting and weather services for basically the airspace over 11% of the globe. And Australia, as we know, is already prone to extreme weather events. We've seen this with the floods just in recent weeks, and the frequency and severity of such events is only likely to grow with an increase in global temperatures. And meanwhile, weather-related data volumes are expected to grow by an order of magnitude as next generation meteorological sensors are developed and deployed, and as the Internet of Things, if you like, takes its leap into the next generation. And if you look at the geopolitical context, well, our ability to rely upon international cooperation and goodwill to obtain data from foreign satellites will surely be tested, in my view at least, in an era of growing international discord and rivalry. So I think there is a strong case solely on meteorological grounds for Australia to have a sovereign capability in Earth observation satellites. Given our geography, our climate profile and exposure, the importance of our agricultural sector in the changing geopolitical landscape, it makes sense. But beyond this, there are other reasons why we should seek to increasingly develop a sovereign space capability, including a launch capability. there's economic imperatives. The importance of space and space-based assets to the modern economy will only grow, with a global space market expected to be worth around $1 trillion by 2040. And with this sort of market comes highly skilled and highly paid jobs, exactly the sort of employment opportunities we need for Australians. There are defence imperatives. The Defence Strategic Updates highlights Australia's dependency on access to space for the ADF's operational capabilities, a dependence that will only deepen in coming years with new technologies and platforms. And there are national resilience imperatives. Space and space-based assets are increasingly critical to the functioning of our modern economy and society, from transportation to financial markets, banking and utilities, and critical information infrastructure. Now, we've made a good start on some of these challenges with the establishment of the Australian Space Agency, with a space strategy that aims to triple the size of the Australian space sector by 2030, and with a growing number of Australian commercial space firms and space startups such as Gilmore Space Technologies. But there is still, I think, a lot more to do here. Australia, as a government at least, invests less as a percentage of GDP on space than nearly any other G20 economy, behind even Indonesia and Argentina. And given the importance of space and space-based assets to our economy, our security and our strategic future, I think space is an area that will demand a higher policy priority and more government investment in the years to come. And it's this same set of circumstances, a more uncertain and a more contested strategic environment, that's driving the most significant upgrade and modernisation of our defence forces in several decades and several generations. We're spending around $270 billion over the next decade in upgrading our capabilities, acquiring new platforms and new weapon systems. And a key part of this, and what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, is our submarine project. This is the acquisition of 12 attack class submarines. Now, this program is estimated to cost $90 billion, which will be the largest and the most complex defence acquisition ever in the history of Australia. This compares to, say, the Joint Strike Fighter project, where we're acquiring 72 fifth generation fighters at a cost of about 25 billion Australian dollars or thereabouts. Now, our attack class design is being built by Naval Group, a French company, and it's a variant of the Barracuda class, which is the next French nuclear-powered attack submarine. The main difference between what we're building, the attack class and the Barracuda class, is that our submarines are going to be conventionally powered, and the changes to the design are those necessary to give us the range needed given our strategic circumstances. Basically, bigger fuel tanks to give a conventional sub the range that would allow us to operate in our strategic environment. Now, I don't believe we can afford, given the delays caused by earlier failures, to make decisions to risk unnecessary delays to this project or to risk opening up a capability gap. So I am a supporter of proceeding with the acquisition of the attack class submarines and the program. As it is, the first attack class submarine will not enter into service for at least a decade, the early 2030s, and the last one's not expected to enter into service until around 2053. And we will need already to extend the life of the Collins class submarines to make sure we keep a submarine capability throughout this period. So I'm enough of a pragmatist to recognise that there's a path dependency in this process, and that where we are today in part reflects the decisions we took a decade or more ago. But I'm also enough of an idealist to want to consider this issue from first principles. Now, the stated requirement of our submarine force is that it be regionally superior as opposed to other defence forces, and to be able to deter actions against Australia's interests when required and respond if necessary with credible military force. And it's no secret that conventionally powered submarines have significant limitations compared to nuclear submarines. They're slower to transit. They cannot sustain high speeds. They need to surface more often. Their range is more limited, and they're less able to loiter undetected. This is simply the result of physics, the different properties of the two propulsion systems, nuclear versus conventional, usually diesel or electric. And this means that, as opposed to nuclear submarines, conventional submarines are, generally speaking, less effective in anti-submarine warfare, less effective in anti-surface warfare, less effective in intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, or ISR roles. And this is particularly pronounced for a geography such as ours, where we expect our submarines are going to be called to serve a long way from their home ports. Now, the defence strategic documents, or guidance, if you like, recognises that around half the world's submarines will be operating in the Indo-Pacific in our theatre by 2035. And it also notes that Australia has the largest maritime domains in the world, and that we need the capacity to defend these. The United States Russia, France, China, and the United Kingdom all build and operate nuclear submarines, and they're considered so superior, in fact, that the United States, the United Kingdom, and France don't run anything else. They don't run conventional subs. They only run nuclear subs. India, Brazil, and Korea are all considering or in the process of acquiring nuclear submarines. So it's very clear to me that Australia should at least not be ruling this out in the future. In all other elements of our defence forces, the Army, the Air Force, and the Navy, we don't shy away from embracing the best technology. Indeed, we know that our qualitative military edge, our ability to sustain a regionally superior military, notwithstanding our relatively small standing defence force, depends upon us doing just this. Now, some would argue, and some have argued, that we lack the necessary expertise to sustain such a submarine, but in fact, Australia does have quite widespread and long-standing nuclear scientific and engineering expertise, dating back to at least 70 years to the founding of the Australian Atomic Energy Commission and through to ANSTO. Today, we've currently got 1,200 staff who work at ANSTO, including over 200 engineers with nuclear experience. And indeed, our current research reactor, known as Opal, which is at Lucas Heights, has very many common elements to what's called a small modular reactor, or SMR, such as that which could be used either for power production or for naval propulsion. And in any event, depending on the design used, the need for maintenance is often quite limited. The US and the UK nuclear submarines, for instance, don't require refuelling during the life of the vessel. Now, some would argue that neither the UK or France or the United States would share with us the necessary technology. I don't believe that that's a proposition that has been seriously tested. And I think the true obstacle here is Australia's neuralgia towards nuclear. We're the only one of 3 G20 countries that does not derive some form of our energy from nuclear power. And we're the only country in the world, to my knowledge, with an actual legislative prohibition against nuclear power. But what we're talking about here with submarines is a small modular nuclear reactor, not dissimilar in size to our nuclear research reactor at Lucas Heights. Now, as I said, I'm enough of a pragmatist to accept that we are where we are, but I do believe that this is an issue that we will need to revisit in the future, and certainly well before 2053, when the last of our attack class conventional subs is due to be delivered. If Australia's strategic regional environment is becoming more contested than it is, if Australia will need to be increasingly self-reliant when it comes to defeating attacks on our sovereignty, and we will, and if our submarines are to play a significant role in deterrence and response, and they must, then we need to be open to the best technology available, one that will ensure our submarines remain regionally superior, and that this necessarily means proper consideration of nuclear submarines for Australia. Now, finally, and just to wrap up, let me touch on one last issue. And though this is a little bit of a strange segue, and it comes quite naturally to me to discuss and debate external threats to Australia, I am conscious that threats to nations can just as often come from within. And I think in our language in Australia, we're often less high-minded and more modest in how we use it. Our national challenge is not dissimilar to that of when it comes to domestic and social policy, is not that dissimilar to that of the United States. That is to create a more perfect union. And to my mind, a glaring imperfection in our current union in Australia is our enduring failure to reach a just, equitable and proper accommodation with our Indigenous Australians. To me, it remains unfinished national business, and the absence of a proper settlement inevitably weakens us as a nation. Our Indigenous heritage and character should be a source of national strength and pride, not a cause for shame and retribution at our shortcomings there. And there are 2 elements to this, as I said. One is the practical but vital task of closing the gap, as it's known, so that our Indigenous Australians are sharing as fully in the life of the nation as other Australians. But the other, an equally important element, is properly incorporating our Indigenous heritage into our national character. And this means ensuring our Indigenous heritage is properly reflected in our national symbols of identity, our flag, our anthem, our language, and indeed our constitution. These 2 elements necessarily go hand in hand, but both must be addressed and resolved, to my mind, if we're to move forward as a nation. Now, this enterprise is well underway with the development of a new Closing the Gap framework, with a new joint council on closing the gap, and with the Indigenous voice co-design process underway. But we need to ensure that this remains as an issue at the top of our national agenda. Now, finally, in conclusion, I'm often asked if I have any regrets about leaving diplomatic life and moving into the political sphere. Well, the short answer is not in the slightest. Of course, politics is a lot more rough and tumble. I certainly get a lot more free character assessments and unsolicited performance appraisals than I ever did as an ambassador. But to serve in the nation's parliament and represent an electorate there, to be able to contribute at the coalface of great national challenges facing us as a nation is a great privilege and honour. And it's a great strength of our political system, to my mind, that our most significant national decisions are taken by elected representatives, not by appointed experts, and by people who are directly elected and directly accountable to the public they serve. Thank you for your time and attention this evening.
Dave Sharma, many thanks for a wide-ranging reflection on your time from DFAT into Parliament. So we're coming to questions discussion. Those who want to join in, their instructions are on the on how to ask a question or make a comment are on the invitation email, which you all have. And as I said, we're taking points of discussion or questions broadly on the topic of the talk. Can we just lead up to your time? I guess you were first well known in Australia as the ambassador in Israel. You got some character assessments then, as I recall, even though you were a diplomat and not a politician. But how did you see the role? Because it seemed to me that you saw your role as representing Australia in Israel. You didn't see your role as reflecting the interest of Israel back to Australia or telling the Israeli government what it might or should be doing. So how did you see your role as an ambassador?
Yeah, so I think the way I'd encapsulate it is I always saw myself as ambassador to a country and not ambassador to a conflict. I think often people who are stationed in Israel think they're basically the Middle East special envoy of their country, and their job is to somehow broker a solution to a conflict that has bedeviled the minds of the finest diplomats over many decades, and countries with a lot more influence and standing out of the world than us. And I always had a view that I've been sent as the Australian ambassador to Israel. There's a lot more to this relationship than just the Israel-Palestinian conflict, and I wanted to make sure that I gave those other parts of the relationship full attention. The other thing I think I had in mind was that I was there to represent the elected government of the day, and quite bluntly, the views of the elected government towards Israel did not necessarily always square with the views of the bureaucracy, but I took the view that I was appointed and served the elected government. That's who's, and they had I was appointed by a Labor government, but I predominantly served under a coalition government. Julia Gillard, who appointed me, was a very pro-Israel Labor Prime Minister. And of course, Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, Prime Ministers I later served, were both the same. And I took the view that I needed to reflect their own attitude and warmth towards Israel and the Jewish people and the role I performed. And I wasn't there to be an umpire or to arbitrate or to referee or to be a critic of Israel. That would be a misinterpretation of the role that I was sent to do.
Thanks. We go to Mark Tedeschi and then Herbert Hubbard. Mark? There's Mark there. So we go to Herbert. Is Herbert there?
Yes, Gerard, thank you very much. Well, let me first say what a fabulously stimulating talk, really most impressive. And second, if I may say, I'm speaking from your old university town of Cambridge, where the sun is just coming up. But a question I really wanted to raise is that in about November 2019, I went to a 4 academies meeting at Government House, and it was on space. And it was said there by a number of people that Australia spent the second most amount of money on space. And this was due to the fact that America, when they went into space, needed to have places where they could look into the spaceships. And they built a lot of places in Australia. And that was basically this foundation of this one-day meeting.
That's interesting. My understanding is that the figure I cited was Australian government expenditure as a percentage of GDP. So perhaps there's been spending on space by foreign countries or United States and others, which is not captured by that figure. But in terms of our own national effort and national expenditure, my understanding is where the sort of the third lowest in the G20. And as I said, we spend less as a percentage of GDP than either Indonesia or I can't remember the other country. Certainly in less than Indonesia and Korea. Though.
Well, of course, there could be a difference between government spending and private spending.
Yes, true.
Yeah. Okay, so is Mark around?
Yes,
Mark
I'm
Robin Fitzsimmons. Oh, hang on. Okay, Mark. Yep, we're up.
Yeah. Thank you very much for a very inspiring speech. Do you think that there should be a general renewed debate in Australia about nuclear power in general?
Yeah, I think there should be, Mark. I mean, I think, to be honest, I think the subs might be an easy way into that. I do think there should be a debate. The submarines, I think there's a compelling kind of strategic and national interest need to look at this. And of course, we're talking about small scale reactors that would by and large be operating offshore or in the water. So they're not in someone's backyard. They're not going to create the same domestic political constituencies to oppose it. But I think, look, I think we do need to get, more, not even more comfortable. It may well be that, small modular nuclear reactors aren't part of the future energy mix, and Australia's kind of distributed nature of our population means we're never going to go down a large nuclear power plant pathway. It's never going to be economic. But I think we're the only country that sort of point blank refuses to examine these issues. And there's lots of countries with whom we identify and who we think are quite like-minded to us, like Canada that runs nuclear reactors, or Japan and Korea that have, nuclear programs. Japan had many nuclear reactors, of course. And I think, as I said, we're one of only 3 G20 countries in the world that don't extract some power from nuclear technology. And I think it's we shouldn't have an inhibited national discussion around these issues. I mean, how often do we hear this refrain that we should listen to the experts on any number of issues? Well, what about all the nuclear scientists and environmental scientists who say we need to be exploring the possibility of nuclear power if we want to move to a lower emissions footprint, and the defence and strategic experts who will tell us that if we're not at least looking at the idea of a nuclear submarine, we're basically taking a capability that's suboptimal and making do with that. I mean, I think this is a real problem for our national interests.
Thank you,
Robin.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Dave, for a very interesting talk. You brought up your background. If I could ask you about lessons you might have learnt for Australia from a couple of aspects of your background. The first being in Israel, which has obviously made massive scientific advances while being a desert. What lessons has that for the development of Australian technology and indeed the retention of equity and intellectual property in Australia when we require overseas capital? And secondly, in relation to your time in Cambridge, what do you think needs to be changed in Australian higher education policy to make it as attractive for people from Britain or the United States and elsewhere for that matter, to come to Australia as it is for Australian universities, as it is for Australians to go to places like Cambridge and so forth? And I speak as someone with a great deal of fondness for Cambridge, but I'd be interested in your answers to those questions.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin. Nice to see you on this call. Look, I think in terms of Israel, Israel is sort of, to turn this on its head, Australia, sometimes we've got a curse of abundance, and Israel has a blessing of scarcity. And what I mean by that is because Israel has historically had very little in the way of natural resources. They've recently found gas, but they've had a sort of a small land area, not particularly arable land, not much debt. They've always relied very heavily on investing in their human capital because that's been their main resource. Whereas Australia has been blessed, but it's also been a curse with natural resources ad infinitum or almost ad infinitum, very arable land, prosperous, secure, a continent to ourselves. And I think that means that sometimes, we have a bit of we're not forced to take difficult national decisions because they're not put upon us. I mean, the periods when we have had to do it in our history and we've taken sort of big leaps forward have tended to be when we've been under significant pressure. So obviously, World War II, and the period around then, World War I to a lesser degree. But even in the early 1980s, when the dollar was under pressure, the fixed exchange rate was under pressure, our living standards had been slipping consistently down the world. Took a big decision that we had to reform and modernise our economy. So I think Israel is a sort of classic case of necessity, breeds invention, but also breeds policy bravery. It is hard in Australia to sort of create some of that sense of urgency from time to time to kind of get over vested interests and stakeholders and to advance a policy agenda. On higher education, look, I confess I'm not an expert in this area whatsoever, but it does strike me that I would like to see the emergence of probably just a small number of quite elite institutions in Australia, rather than the quite homogenous tertiary offering that we tend to have now. I mean, this is, everyone knows the UK for Cambridge and Oxford and maybe one or two others. Everyone knows the US for, MIT, Harvard, Yale, but they've allowed elite universities to emerge that partly that's because of their wealth. They've got big big land holdings in the case of the UK, or big capital funds and endowments in the case of the US. But I think we do a good job of sort of Australian tertiary education offering a relatively good quality, relatively affordable, but quite homogenous offering, which means we struggle to kind of have excellence in any one area. And I think it would be good to see Australian universities establish, just one or two of them, establish some particular areas of excellence, because I think that's how we'll attract genuine international talent and research money and everything that flows from that.
Reversing the Dawkins reforms.
No. Sorry, we got to move on. So Fred Chilton and then Paul Blanket. Fred.
Yeah, thanks very much, Gerard and David. Just on that last point, we do have some centres of excellence in quantum computing, particularly at Sydney and UNSW. Now, my comment was about the submarines. As an ex-army person, my understanding is that we really struggled to get enough crews to keep the 6 Collins class in the water, because you need at least 2 crews for every sub, even when they're being refurbed. We're going to 12. Are you confident that we're going to be able to find enough good people to man those 12 subs? And does that, by the time we get to the 2050s and things, head more towards unmanned underwater vehicles, UUVs and so on?
Look, I think so. Undoubtedly, that's a challenge for Navy. And I was down at Garden Islands last week on one of the air warfare destroyers, but we were talking about when the Navy's sort of scaling up in a whole lot of ways. We've got 3 air warfare destroyers, we've got 9 future frigates, we've got supply vessels. So they need more people around, but submariners are kind of a particularly unique profession. They impose particular hardships on people. So look, I think it will be a challenge to get the skilled crew and retain them. To get 12 submarines operational, that will be sometime in the sort of, probably it's going to be like the late 2030s, early 2040s. But ultimately, I mean, I think, look, if you make a profession attractive enough, you can get the people in there. So, conditions of service will probably have to improve. Pay will probably have to improve. Some of the traditional elements of military life, which tends to be tough on families and partners, will need to be altered. Those sorts of things will do it. But I think Navy, my sense is Navy is thinking about all this. But I think, that's a problem that we can solve. Australia is still an attractive place where people want to come and live and work. We're always going to attract migrants. We should be able to solve labour force issues. I think you're right. I mean, I expect we're going to see increasingly, autonomous. We're certainly seeing obviously autonomous or unmanned aerial vehicles playing an increasing role in kind of in the air domain, and we'll definitely see it in the underwater or subsurface domain as well. I mean, obviously at the moment, they tend to be sort of adjunct platforms or kind of auxiliaries or capability enhanced for intelligence collection. And I think that's probably where it will go in submarines. I mean, I think the major attack platforms will still be manned by and large, but we'll have increasingly unmanned vessels to do sort of ISR roles and resupply and things like that. But I think it would be good to say, well, in 50 years, we won't need manned submarines. We can do all this autonomously. But
you will.
Risk we probably can't take right now. It might be that that's where things go, but it's too early to be betting just on that side of things.
Thank you.
Paul Blanket.
Thanks, Dave. let's make the big assumption that in the last reshuffle, you suddenly find yourself in the foreign minister's job. What do you see as the major strategic priority facing Australia at the moment from in an international relations perspective?
Look, I think the main priority is to build and foster a coalition to preserve the world in which we live, you know, which means basically to preserve the post-World War II order, the system of states, the you know, freedom of navigation at sea, the sovereign equality of states, the principles of non-interference, the non-weaponisation of trade disputes. And, you know, undoubtedly the biggest challenge to that order, it's not the only challenge, but is China's emergence as a global power, which is increasingly showing itself to be a non-status quo power. You know, it's got an agenda where it wants to change some of these rules and orders. So I think for us, the main task of Australian diplomacy is to help build the coalitions to sort of manage China's rise. China's rise or China's emergence is inevitable. There's not much we can do about that, but we can try and do what we can to encourage it to behave responsibly and to deter it from behaving irresponsibly. And that means, you know, relations with the US, but that's no longer enough. It's, you know, relations with Japan, Korea, and India, but with further afield with countries that are sort of global actors, particularly in Europe, that can help support that order and can help set the norms and set the frameworks and things like that. And increasingly, I mean, we're seeing in Australian diplomacy that these are the sort of actors we're mixing with, whether it's the Quad configuration, Japan, India, the US, and Australia, whether it's our growing interactions with Europe. I mean, we have a lot more to do with Europe these days than we did 10 or 15 years ago, when most of the debate and discussion was about trade and you know, common agricultural policy. These days we have strategic discussions with Europe, but even, you know, what we're doing bilaterally with countries like Indonesia, with countries like Korea, the growing role for the Five Eyes, not just as an intelligence sharing community, but as another community, the G7+3 effectively, which is like a sort of a Western Bloc emergence. I think these are all the kind of areas where Australia needs to be doing, investing a lot more, basically to sort of buttress the international order, coordinate our responses more to kind of breakouts and attempts to overturn elements of that, and you know, provide each other support from reprisals. I mean, I think I've been quite encouraged by the number of countries who, you know, to put it in schoolyard language, when China has been picking on Australia, the number of other countries that have come to stand along our side, be it the United States, Japan, the Europeans, the United Kingdom. And I think it's important that we show the same sort of solidarity, because when China sees sort of unity and concert in action like that and can no longer bring its asymmetric weight to bear on any given bilateral relationship, which it can with almost any relationship other than the one it has with the United States and to a degree with Russia, that's how we're going to shape their behaviour, by pushing back when they seek to push forward on certain issues.
We go Simon Jeans, Dimitri Bernscheid, and Justin Paddy. Simon.
Right. Yes. Hello, Gerard and Dave. I wanted to ask you about Syria. You gave a speech on Syria in October 2019. I really want to know, when will Australia accept the outcome of the civil war? That is, the armed Islamic groups supported by Western powers have been defeated, and the government of Syria is the legitimate representative of the Syrian people, realising that it's the only group or organisation that will protect the minority Christian community there. And you can see what's happened to the Iraqi community, where a population of 1.4 million Christians has gone down to, I mean, who knows, probably under 400,000, possibly less. So when will Australia recognise the outcome of the war and help to rebuild Syria and encourage those Syrians in neighbouring countries to be able to return in safety?
Look, I don't think we can, and I don't think the Australian public would support us playing a role in rebuilding Syria whilst Assad remains in power. Someone who's used chemical weapons against his own people and violated international norms. I don't pretend that there's a regular alternative there. I don't think there is one. I mean, you're right that the Assad forces supported and up by Iran, reconquered most of the country. There's still a rebel enclave around Idlib. There's still a kind of a Turkish northern security zone, and there's still the whole northeast of the country that's controlled by Kurdish forces and militia. Look, as Australia, we recognise states, we don't recognise government, so we'll deal with whoever it is. I mean, whoever the Syrian representative is in New York, I expect that we deal with them as a matter of necessity. That's how we are with most countries. But I don't see us, I mean, Assad does not yet have the country under control entirely, but I think you have to have, I think there are serious question marks about his legitimacy. I don't accept his legitimacy. I could be compelled to if the rest of the West is doing it, but I don't think this is an area where Australia would be seeking to move first.
Dimitri.
Thanks, Gerard, and thank you for your comments, Dave. Just briefly on submarines, perhaps given your time in Israel, you might want to share with your colleagues the experience of the Israeli government in 1973 and the reliability of the French military. However, my question is, could you please share any thoughts you may have around China and what's happening in the South China Sea and Taiwan at the moment, please?
Yeah, of course. I think you're referring to the Israeli reliance on Mirage jets during the Yom Kippur War and the French decision under de Gaulle not to help with basically spare parts and repair and refueling, which was a significant setback. The difference, I guess, with us is we're building the submarines here, and I can't imagine we'll have that sort of difference with the French, but that's always an argument for sovereign capability. I guess there is. Look, on the South China Sea, so China, particularly in the Taiwan Strait, continues to behave quite provocatively, sending kind of Air Force patrols down the Taiwan Strait, conducting exercises, simulated targeting, simulated drills against notional US aircraft carriers in the Taiwan Strait. They've also they had a flotilla of about 200 odd vessels that occupied a disputed reef. The Philippines claims as their own, again, another sort of submerged land, piece of land at high tide, so one that wouldn't normally give rise to territorial claims. China has, as you know, reclaimed land significantly in the South China Sea, turned that reclaimed land into airstrips and hangars, and they have now military assets based there, notwithstanding the promise that President Xi made to President Obama not to militarise the South China Sea. They've done just that. In Taiwan, I think that this is the obvious flashpoint for US-China tensions in coming years. There will be other tensions, trade, intellectual property, and a number of other things, but in terms of what's likely to lead to war, most likely Taiwan. And I think there is a concern that President Xi would like to see Taiwan reunified with the motherland, in his words, as a sort of a legacy issue for him, something he'd like to have resolved on his watch. Increasingly China has the capability for that to at least be a realistic proposition, an arms takeover of Taiwan. Doesn't mean it would be easy, doesn't mean it would be very costly, but it's possible now from a military perspective in a way that it wouldn't have been 10 or 15 years ago. So I think that is a concern. I think the US planners are very much focused on this. They're quite alive to this possibility, and they're doing quite a bit to help support Taiwan's resilience, but also their own capacity to respond to that sort of a scenario. I think the scenario we need to plan for is the difficulty if China decides to decided to invade Taiwan, for argument's sake, how long will it take for coalition of allied forces to respond, how far are they from that theatre, and how much would things be a fait accompli before we can kind of get in the game. And I think that's where the US is doing a lot of work on its force posture in the region to basically make sure that there are triggers and kind of speed bumps and signs beforehand so that they can respond so it doesn't reach that sort of a point. Because if it reaches that point, we're in a very difficult and quite a sort of bloody and protracted conflict, which means the political appetite to do it will be a whole lot less. So I think, I think China's going to continue to push forward on Taiwan. Their ideal scenario would be that, Taiwan is reunified without a single shot being fired by a mixture of sort of threats and blandishment and coercion. And I think that's probably still the most likely scenario, but we also need to prepare for a potential military scenario there.
We're running very close to the end, so we've got second last question, Justin, which has got to be quick.
Oh,
so
thanks,
Justin.
Gerard. Yes, Dave, just on the question of Indigenous recognition, which you raised, I guess you've got very definite ideas yourself about the path that you see should be followed. Are you having any input into what Ken Wyatt is actually putting together, and can you give us any idea as to how long it might be before we see something concrete emerging?
Yeah, so I think, look, I do have some input, but I would stress that there are others in the Parliament who are much better versed on these issues than me. But I think, look, the Indigenous voice co-design process, which I think everything is kind of waiting on that by and large, is still underway. I'd expect them to sort of come back, finish their consultations and come back with a model probably around the middle of this year. And then it will be then the questions will then fall in our laps as politicians about how do we do this? Where's the constitutional recognition piece in this? Do we legislate the voice but make a reference to is there a sort of constitutional enshrinement piece of this or not? I think that is likely. I mean, anything constitutional or referendum oriented is not going to happen in this term of Parliament. But I think the earliest it could happen, and when I think it probably should happen, is in the next term of Parliament.
Finally, how's Wentworth at a time of pandemic? How's the local scene? Difficult?
So I think, look, generally speaking, I think Wentworth is not, the electorate has not been particularly exposed to the pandemic, not like certain, it hasn't been overly exposed to the pandemic. It's had a few sectors that have taken a disproportionate impact. So the travel agents is an obvious one, but also people who tend to work in international tourism, which tends to be more, in my electorate, people who work in aviation. So people who work at the airports, pilots, cabin crew, air staff and whatnot. Those are the sectors where I've noticed taking the biggest hit. Small businesses generally actually tended to do not uniformly well, but not too badly, because with a lot more people working from home, they've been, patronising coffee shops and restaurants in the area. I think restaurants and coffee shops, anecdotally, are kind of almost back to whole and back to normal. People in the financial sector and the markets and professional services seem to have done quite well through this as well. So it's really, I'd say, if the sectors are, and then universities have suffered somewhat because they've laid off staff. But if I had to characterise the parts of the Wentworth that are doing it the toughest, it's travel agents and aviation. And I think we've got an aviation rescue package, and I'm pretty sure there'll be something specific for travel agents beyond what's already been announced quite soon.
Well, many thanks for giving generously of your time tonight, and it's good news for travel agents, I think. So thanks for that. Look, it's a very wide-ranging view from your time as early in Australia through your career, and it's been a fascinating career so far, and I'm sure there's many more fascinating times to come, and we'd love to have you back when we get back to our normal meetings. But for tonight, we've done this on Zoom. We're very grateful for your time, and it's an important paper, and I'll be very pleased to publish it in the Sydney paper soon, and this will go out as well. So Dave Sharma, thanks a lot.
Thanks very much, Gerard.